to Ministry Mondays with Meg. I'm Meg. I'm Reverend Meg Biddle. Welcome to the show. Ministry Mondays with Meg is about ministry that happens beyond the regular church traditional worship service because ministry is messy and it's beautiful and people come and tell their stories, and I am just grateful for each and every one of them. Today, my guest, I want to say, like, my guest needs no introduction, but I'm guessing, there might be somebody in this world that hasn't been called by Jared to ask if they would love to serve in beautiful upstate New York. Um, my guest is the Reverend Jerrod Hugenot, who is the Associate Executive Minister of ABC New York State and has been since 2013. Also author of in the Christian Citizen, Baptist News Global, Good Faith Media, Ministry Matters, and in the show notes, I will make sure that I put links to all of those. Cat and dog dad. And I'm glad to have you as my guest today, Jared. Welcome to the show.
Well, glad to be here, Meg.
So for people who don't know you, introduce yourself. Tell them a little bit about you.
Well, I grew up in Kansas and was part of the an American Baptist Church since I was about 9 or 10. So I guess you could say I've been here quite a while in the denomination. It's the only church family I've known. Grew up in Kansas, which is in American Baptist speak, the American Baptist churches of the Central region. And I then went on to university at Ottawa University and then seminary in Kansas City, Kansas, at Central Baptist Theological Seminary. So both American Baptist schools. I've served in urban settings, was with a congregation in Kansas City, Kansas as a part-time minister while I worked a full-time job. And that was where I was ordained. And then I had some pastoral experience for 7+ years in Bennington, Vermont. And so some people get a little surprised about about Vermont and Kansas kind of seeming very disparate places to be. But that's just where God called me. So I've worked in Kansas, worked in Vermont, and then a decade ago was called onto the regional ministry staff of the essentially the upstate New York region. American Baptist Churches of New York State is 267 churches across upstate New York, and then the Rochester, Genesee region and the Metro New York region are sister regions, but we cover pretty much the bulk of upstate New York. So we cover Buffalo to this New England state line, down to Westchester, on up to Plattsburgh, Binghamton, Syracuse. We cover a lot of territory. And we have, like I said, a lot of different churches in urban and rural settings. And so it's a great region and always glad to talk about it.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, Jared stole me from Indiana, where I'm originally from, and I was called to serve my first church in beautiful upstate New York in a village called Central Square. So it is lovely. They measure snow in feet, not inches. But yeah, I had a really great experience, especially with the region and just the amount of support. My women clergy group and things like that I had there. So I've got a lot of love for upstate New York. So so you've been at ABCNYS for over 10 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And now what you came to so you're going to talk about your sabbatical project. Is that right? Is that where we're what I call it?
Yeah, I had a sabbatical for 14 weeks last year, midsummer to the end of September. And some of that time, of course, is spent in project work in this region. And so, the idea was to come back and have a piece that was productive and useful to the needs of the region. Since my portfolio is very much always been in the search and call support process, every day, uh, you know, we have to, talk about pastoral transition. With 267 churches, I've not really known a time in this past decade where we haven't had about, upwards of 24 churches in transition, sometimes more, sometimes less. The pandemic certainly kind of, as ever we talk about, had a bit of a sea change in how we did things. But at the same time, we have, these churches that are looking more and more for part-time clergy. And so part of my project was to summarize some of the learnings from the last decade, as well as, in some ways, think imaginatively about where the next decade is going.
Mhm.
And so part-time was kind of already coming into prominence in 2013. We estimate, because again, we're not a denomination of great statistical keeping. And so
Right.
sometimes our best advice is, well, from our anecdotal knowledge. After a while, it became apparent to me that the supermajority of our churches, one way or the other, are calling, or at least, to use the word paying, compensating a pastor part-time equivalent. And so part of my educational curve is to help churches understand and maybe reinforce concepts that perhaps they didn't have offered to them, or maybe now thinking a little bit more along those lines. A part-time pastor in the history of Christianity is very much the norm. In the history of this country, very much the norm. We did get in the 19th and 20th century into this mindset, for good and for bad, of this professionalization of clergy. And the idea of a full-time minister was held up as the goal. And yet, so many of our churches historically have had part-time clergy. It's just, we just
Yeah.
sometimes haven't had the words.
Right. So, as we're getting into this, do you know about how many churches in your region are part-time versus full-time?
Again and again, anecdotal,
Right.
the queen of all statistics,
Right.
anecdotal. Uh,
All
I
hail.
measured 60 to 70%.
Okay, that's what I was that's what I was
Yeah.
guessing
Yeah.
was
I mean, for example, at the first of the year, I kind of went through my list of churches in transition, and presently, we have two that are actively seeking, shall we say, profiles for ministry life. And we have maybe two. I anticipate another two might come into some sort of search actively in 2024. Um, but the majority of these churches are, again, part-time. And so the upfront conversation is to say, hi, this is what a part-time minister looks like.
yeah.
Uh, and I think folks are generally very happy to get some concepts to hold on to think about. We all know Baptists know how to react, but I do appreciate the reflection that I do hear after we've made a presentation. Folks have kind of sat with the idea for a bit, and they say, well, yeah, this makes sense. We just didn't know how to name it or to quantify it.
Yeah. So I guess as we start, how do you define part-time? Is it by compensation, by hours? I mean, what's your
Yes,
definition of a part-time pastor?
both and.
Both and.
Yeah. Yeah, when I started this early on, one of my first articles that you'll find online about ministry here was a piece I wrote about compensating your minister, paying your minister fairly. Uh, I'm not a big fan of using the word competitive when we talk about clergy compensation. Kind of goes against the grain of the vocation. It also goes against the reality that, I'd rather a pastor be compensated fairly and equitably. Uh, and, certainly we have a few congregations who ask about, the older language of salary bands, what range, what negotiation. Then we have the bulk of our churches where, there's a fixed amount of money in the budget that can be afforded for the pastor. And so I think we have to respect that. Say, well, if you have a certain amount of money, then probably you ought to quantify that as a certain amount of time. So the dollars and duties, as I called it at the time, kind of like a
Mm,
scale that, when there's balance, if it's a halftime position and a halftime compensation, then I think in the long run, the pastor's going to stay and the congregation's going to adjust, especially as many come into part-time because a longtime pastor is retired. It's kind of like, oh, well, we can't continue with where that pastor left off, so we're going to reduce. But again, sometimes people want to cut the budget, but they also don't have help understanding how that changes the balance of the duties. Um, One of the things, if you think in terms of quarters, full time, 3/4, half time, quarter time, that could be helpful. If you take 40 as a ballpark number, I always say ish or plus because ministry is, as you said earlier, messy.
mhm,
And there are some weeks where it's definitely plus, and other weeks where it might be blessedly 40. I will
mhm.
say, as a caveat, my spouse also reminds me full time and part time clergy ought to also take time for Sabbath, days off, breathing, not being stressed out 24/7, and so
Yeah,
little things like that.
right.
Uh,
I
and
recall.
so, yeah, you want to respect the fact that you're calling a human being
Yeah,
to be your pastor,
yeah.
and so
So,
that go ahead.
no, is this really a realistic thing? I mean, how do you so I guess with me, I'm thinking about my own experience, in New York, is lovely people, but they were doing yard sales and having dinners every month to try and come up with enough to pay me, and sometimes they still couldn't, um, and they weren't willing to come to that place where they would say, "We need to go part-time." So, I was the one who was gonna have to go because they were gonna kill themselves continuing at that rate. I mean, and even, like, when you had conversations, or tried to have conversations with boards about, "Well, what if she went somewhere where she could share?" They went, "Woo." I mean, so how do you even get there with a a church, a congregation that's like, "Yeah, I think
Mhm.
we could go share a pastor. We could go from part-time to." I mean, what's the process like?
Well, in the beginning, one thing about Baptist congregations, American Baptist congregations, is each and every church is autonomous. And so I say the region, for example, has the power of suggestion. We're there to encourage, to communicate ideas, best practices. But then, at the end of the day, there's no thou shalt in our polity. And anytime you meet a Baptist who says thou shalt, we all kind of look suspiciously at
Right.
what part did they miss? Our idea is to share the best practices and what's working in other churches. But at the end of the day, the church itself, the local church, has to be willing to make those shifts. And so we do our best to share what we hope is very bankable, helpful information. but it's ultimately up to the congregation to have that internal conversation. So, for example, if a church is autonomous, it also means they alone are responsible for what sort of pastoral work they do, how they evaluate, is this working for us? How is the balance between what the ordained person does versus the lay leadership of the church? And so I think there's a lot of different balls in the air to have these conversations, and it may just take time. In 10 years, I have had a small number of churches where I've been with a different search committee for that church now 2 times, in one case, 3 times. And so as I've had that longevity and that visibility to a congregation as, kind of part of their landscape of who they can talk to beyond themselves, I have found some churches that were very unprepared, not ready to say, we're ready for this 10 years ago, who might be more receptive to talking about these different concepts, these new ideas. But in the midst of the congregation, it's also important to communicate. I think sometimes one of the breakdowns in a lot of church fights is a kind of toxicity or an ambient anxiety that just kind of grows from, occasional to chronic, to the point that, it's very hard to think when you're kind of stuck in fight or flight mode. And a lot of our churches, especially after the 2008 financial crisis and this pandemic time we've been in, those are two points of reference for me in ministry, where I can certainly say the church had to regroup and refocus, and also learn that it's okay to every once in a while shake the Etch-a-Sketch. We are a people not of books of order, books of discipline, canon law. So we don't have, and we're very proud of it for good reason. Yeah. We're not beholden to outside authority. But I do find that churches do need to sometimes figure out how to talk to one another. And on the flip side, how to talk outside of the four walls. One of the best parts of my job, and I think most important pastoral parts of my job, is to say across the table, here's the good news. You are not alone. And if they hear that, I will say they're very receptive to the fact that it's just not their church that's struggling with finances. Somebody once said it's like the ABCs. Now for us, we perk up and go, ooh, American Baptist churches. Yeah. But really, this ABC acronym is, a lot of churches think about attendance, building, and cash. And that frames their whole thinking. Whereas, we encourage churches to think about their neighborhoods, opportunities, and ways of changing the frame of reality, the big picture, in a way that might be more life-giving than just feeling stuck. And so sometimes the search for a new pastor is also an opportunity to think a little more broadly about the big picture of the church, the economics. So many churches now are talking about downsizing their governance structures, going from multiple boards to single. A lot of churches are talking about finance and property management. Today, when we talk about like an interim period, we hope that a church might have an interim period and might work with a pastor who has some skills in that area. But the idea is to coach change through looking at the big picture. And we have churches who sometimes say, I actually had one recently that says, before we actually really get the search committee going, I think we really need to deal with our governance structure. And I think that's yeah. And other churches where perhaps a building is starting to take up more and more of the energy. An Episcopal church priest and consultant we've worked with here and there, Jerrod Hugenot, his late uncle was president of Central Seminary back in the day. So, good American Baptist connections there. But, in the Episcopal Church these days, he talked about, 3 categories that you should look at your expenses for. If your church, you got your income, you got your mission giving. Mission giving is very important. And then you have your expenses. The mission giving is money, that comes in that is there to be sent out. It's not to be retained or kept for the operations of the church. So your income that comes in for sustaining the local church and your expense budget, take those expenses and put those into 3 buckets. The cost of the building, the cost of programming, and the cost of people or staffing. A lot of our churches, it might be just a person, like your pastor. Now, the other thing, though, that he has shown, and I think this is brilliant, is most, in his mind, churches that are doing well, that are sustainable, maybe not, bringing in people by the thousands on a Sunday morning, big global tele-evangelist ministry, smoke machines and flashy. The churches that are sustainable. And I think that's a key word these days. How is this going to be a sustainable decision? We'll look at spending about 50% on people. 50% of your budget being dedicated to the sustaining of the ministry of the church, the pastor, those who help the ministry go that aren't there in a volunteer capacity. 25% should be spent on programming, discipleship, Christian ed, all that stuff that makes church lively. Now, anybody who's listening, who's doing the math, is like 50 plus 25. Oh, he hasn't gotten to the building. And I've seen people do this running ahead of me going, oh, you're meaning only 25% ought to be spent on brick and mortar? And that is a tough one, because so many churches, if they did that math, are probably at a point of spending 45% or beyond on their physical plant. And that's just the basics, not the deferred maintenance. And so we do have some congregations in times of transition that do think about governance. They think about their finances, and they think about their facilities. And some churches are actually embracing that this building could be, bringing our ministry to peril and divesting of buildings. And that's scary, and that takes a lot of work. But any of those 3 things is a gift to the next minister if you have already worked through those things. I'm a big fan of don't squander the interim time as just keeping the lights on. Let's really dig into who are we, what are we, and how do we adjust.
So what about the congregation that calls you and says, they're in their, let's just say they're in their interim period, and they're going, we're just looking at our numbers and don't see how this time we can call a full-time pastor. Somebody says it's not fair to the pastor, and that to that person that does that, thank you. Because there's nothing worse than coming and falling in love and all of that stuff, and then it being a financial thing. But what what about this? Is this a good idea? Us going part time? Are we just prolonging the inevitable? How how do you how do you work through that?
Well, I think it's good to name what your concerns are, your fears are, your anxieties. Something that I jokingly said when I was a local church pastor is sometimes, you get enough embedded in a congregation, you can sometimes just kind of predict the temperature of the room. Uh, you know, what's it feel like today?
Mhm.
Feels like we're going to have a good Sunday. I mean, I remember doing that a few times. What's it going to be like today? But I think when congregations talk to one another and they put some information on the table, a lot of times congregations, not everybody's interested in the business side of church. Not everybody's financially gifted to think big picture. A church with a sizable endowment could still be in as much of a pickle as a church that just depends on week to week offering plate income only. And again, the key is communicate. We've sometimes advised churches about different ways of kind of getting their information put together in a structure,
Mhm.
some sort of order that helps them kind of see what's going on. So, for example, talking about the pastoral ministry budget, a lot of people just think of the budget, and they don't think about, well, how much money do we have for a pastor? And so I'm very much about, well, could you go to your current budget and pull out those numbers that pertain just to a pastoral call, and let's look at that, but let's not get so much hung up on what each subcategory has for, like, housing or compensation, salary, or blah 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 benefits. Let's look at the bottom line number, because at the end of the day, you're that's the money that the raw total, the bottom line number, is what you are saying you are sustaining
Mm.
for the pastoral ministry. Everybody has different ways they would subdivide, let's say, $60,000, put it in different buckets, different categories, because we all have different needs for things. But at the same time, in many parts of upstate New York, 60,000 total package can be very much a difficult full-time position. New York State's vast. I believe the state of New York, the government has like 10 different discrete economic areas,
Mm.
uh, kind of measure things. So, the closer you get to the city, the greater cost of living is. Other parts of the state are very affordable, but very rural, and so you also have the balance of finding outside employment. So there's all these factors that go into that make me want to say, well, if we're going to be working with these numbers, let's then also start saying, well, we know these numbers are good. A lot of churches would say, yeah, we're good for that. Yeah, that's a sustainable amount of money. And as you know, what we were paying for groceries even before the pandemic versus now,
Yeah.
uh, costs have gone up, and I think people really feel that acutely every time they go to the grocery store, every time they fill up the car.
Yep.
Um,
You
we
cry
realize
just a little bit.
fixed costs are not really a thing.
Yeah.
Fixed income, I mean, a lot of us would say we understand that, but fixed
Yeah.
costs, we understand that's more of a fairy tale.
No.
Uh, the costs of maintaining a pastor should be, again, in that balance analogy, uh, working toward the balance of, well, if the 60,000 we have is going to be what we're working with, we might want to say to an outside group like the region, what do you think? How does this track?
Mm.
And in some parts of the state, it might track better than other parts of the state, but it does feel a little bit towards this is not quite a full-time job, because if that's
Mm.
inclusive benefits and everything, whole enchilada, it does bring this question up of, is this really still a full-time position, which is,
Yeah.
let's say, 40 hours. And so, sometimes, again, churches, as they kind of look at the balance, they also need to say, well, if we're going to go with a minister who's less present because we bless them to be less present, it also raises the question of, how does the congregation step up and fill in some of those gaps? Some of the best congregations that have part-time pastors, it's not just about, well, if the minister doesn't do it, it doesn't get done. There's a collaborative spirit. And in that collaborative spirit, people say, well, I know I can cover the hospital run. If somebody's in our hospital on a Wednesday, I'll take care of that. I'll go see,
Yeah.
this particular person who has requested a visit. When I was first starting in ministry, I was working full time, 40 hours a week. and I agreed to serve quarter time at a church to start getting some experience. And the church was very good about saying, hey, um, just so you know, so and so went into the hospital today, but we know you can't do anything until 5 o'clock. And
That's
so
fantastic.
I didn't realize how lucky I was at the time. I
Yeah.
was just, this is a grace. I could not leave my post between the hours of X and Y. And, I did work for an employer at the time that was very flexible. If I said, I need to go officiate a funeral,
Oh,
they were
sure.
very, very good about that. Not every employer is, but
No.
I would say that was a grace in itself. But when you have somebody say in the same breath, and we know you can't, so get to it when you can, and in the meantime, we'll have somebody there. That I
Then
think is going.
that's the church is gonna work. I mean, or it feels like it's gonna work.
Yeah, I think for a tradition that talks about the priesthood of all believers,
Yeah.
to get a little theological, we still struggle with the ministry of the laity. And so one plus has been in our churches that do kind of have this epiphany that the minister needs to be supported uh, as they're supporting the church. We do have some folks who are picking up lay study classes through the region,
Mhm.
who are leveling up in different aspects of what we might have traditionally called pastoral ministry. One of the things that I've always had a pet peeve about is the phrase pastoral care. Uh,
Mm,
I'd really like to have us say, well, we need to have a culture of congregational care
yeah.
for the pastor and others, uh, deacons, for example, Stephen ministers in some churches that have used that program. It can be a grace. I've also found that sometimes when I would go see somebody, that they were much more interested in the person coming along with me when I go, with a congregant to see somebody, because they've known that person for years, and it
Yeah.
means a lot to them that somebody, they've known for decades shows up to say, "How you doing?" They expect the pastor to do that, but it says something that I think it magnifies or augments the ministry of the church when more lay folk can be involved. And so maybe the pastor could be involved in doing some training. They could use outside support, like the region I work for
Yeah.
has those lay study courses.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there was more than once that I crammed into a minivan with 4 or 5 other people, and we went, through the snow and to a place that I would have never found even with my GPS, um,
Yeah.
and and visited, and you're right, the pastor was expected. Everyone else was bonus, and they were absolutely thrilled. Yeah, yeah. Um, I love that congregational care, though, um, as opposed to pastoral care. I mean, that's
Well,
beautiful.
we have to be more collaborative in
Mhm.
everything we do. We just can't depend on, again, that professionalization of the minister, the pastor. Um, I think, again, a lot of our churches are small membership churches
Mhm.
where if I go to visit and there's 30 people there, that's doing good.
Yeah.
And yet they can be some of the most generous and lively and engaged people. I'd rather be known as a small church that's busy. Uh,
Mhm.
During the 2008 pandemic, it was kind of an affliction, at least the financial crunch. Um, I overheard at that time a consultant for the Alban Institute, and again that kind of dates the story because Alban
Yeah,
has finished its ministry and
right.
it, it's there, but not quite in the same way. One of the comments that really stuck with me, and I think this was Susan Beaumont, who's an American Baptist minister and worked for Alban as a consultant,
Yeah.
that during the financial crunch, you need to be a tugboat because so many churches try to think of themselves as ocean liners.
Ocean liners, yeah.
And, tugboats are maneuverable. They can, navigate the seas a lot quicker, whereas the cathedral size church or the cathedral mentality in a church can be very hard to pivot.
I remember actually going to one of the Alban Institute things when I was in New York,
Mhm.
and that's one of the things that stick with you about, um and then also, like, when you're trying to do the change, the speed of a tugboat or a fishing boat, how long it would take one of those to turn as opposed to how long it takes the ocean liner to make
Mhm.
a turn. So yeah, those are things that definitely, like, stick with you that I'm certainly grateful for, and I'm sure others are. Um, so so was this, I mean, yeah, it was part of your sabbatical, and how you served now. I mean, was this, I'm gonna write about this, I'm gonna use this as my project. Um, was it just because I'm really interested in it? I mean,
Well, if again, um, I have a variety of interests. So if it was something that I would write more for my enjoyment or I guess more academic pursuits, yeah, there's other things I could have done. But again, the understanding is bring something back that can help you continue in your ministry.
yeah,
Uh, 10 years, I could have had a sabbatical around year 7, but again, the aforementioned pandemic. So coming up to my 10th year and finally having a sabbatical was great. Now, I also realize many of our colleagues do not have a sabbatical. And so I take great care in saying that it is kind of a rarer thing. I had 14 weeks. I spent a good chunk of it here at home, and that has its pluses and minuses. The cats thought they were making out like bandits.
right,
They made out like bandits this morning. I put out a large mound of kibble, so I will not
mm,
have guest appearances during this call. Uh,
right,
you know, so, do love them, but honestly, there are times grown-ups are talking children. Um,
right. You've met my
didn't have
cat, you
children, but
know.
I do have cats, so it's a wash.
Mm,
Um, I think the time it was saying, okay, I'm going to be 50 in 2024, so I've still got years ahead. Now, that being said, I have many colleagues for whom they're this age or older, and they're just starting in ministry.
mhm,
And God bless them because they are very often are folks able to do part-time work. Uh,
right,
and so I look at, well, okay, if I'm in regional work, the Lord willing, for another decade, where is the I'm not a football person. Where do the polls move? Where do the
yeah,
yeah, this is where do the benchmarks move? And
yeah,
I think certainly if part time was kind of there and it was just kind of organically happening in 2013 to the point it became very much a common talking point when I met with search committees. It would be probably likely that we would be wanting to talk about churches, sharing church pastors, and
right,
we have at present 14 churches in our region
that
who
are
are sharing.
sharing.
Yeah.
I didn't
Now,
realize that many.
yeah, well, I had to stop and count. There are some areas of the state where this goes back way into the past,
Okay,
and others where this is just a very new thing, and other churches where I'm just starting to engage that conversation. So the piece I wrote on part-time and shared pastors during my sabbatical was in some ways distilling what I have already lived and learned
mm,
in the midst of working with our churches. And the next part is where, as someone who's asked to think about these things and be responsive and on top of things, I think it would be very likely in the next decade shared pastors are going to become a thing.
yeah,
Now, the quirky thing is, if you know other churches in your community, you're like, well, yeah, the United Methodist share a pastor, or the Catholic priest is with 3 parishes in the area. But it seems kind of new and novel. for Baptists in many cases. And again, because we are autonomous, we are single in mind, and for good or for bad sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the idea though is sometimes two churches close by each other, if they're given the right invitation, might be able to have an opportunity to share a pastor, pool their economic resources, and also be able to attract more of a candidate pool.
Yeah.
I know a lot of clergy, at least this is my thought, want to be in ministry full time. When I graduated from Central in 2002, part time was kind of mentioned, but it wasn't dwelled on.
Hmm.
And yet, this last 20 plus years has been a schooling in, we should have been talking about it. It should have been in the curriculum. And so we're seeing improvement in people talking about part time. We're also having to still fight a little bit of residual stigma.
Hmm.
As you mentioned earlier, this idea of, well, if we go this route, is this a harbinger of doom? And
Because it
I'm
feels
like,
like failure.
yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think that's true. Churches want to always embrace the normal that is the most nostalgic for them.
Yeah.
Safe, it's comforting. But I do find that a lot of churches, when they do embrace a little bit beyond their comfort zone concept, sometimes they realize, oh, we feel less burdened now.
Mm.
A part-time minister can serve. We're not worried about them leaving because they're always short every month. Again, at the end of the day, the economics of ministry is well named. We have to deal with, if a church has a parsonage, they'll pay utilities, and they also have 15,000 to work with. That's not a full-time position. But yet you have to kind of populate that idea with the congregation that it is part-time, and once they embrace that, then again they can bless that pastor to come in and not fulfill, frankly, impossible
Yeah.
higher standard.
Yeah. Yeah. Has there been like anything in this process of putting all this together, putting it down on paper or on your laptop, whatever,
Mhm.
that has just surprised you? Like something you've learned along the way?
Hmm. Well, because I'm getting more experience just now in shared pastors, I didn't realize I would need to write as much about local church autonomy.
Mm.
And another colleague in another region, when he heard about this project right off the bat, was, how are you going to navigate autonomy? I was like, fair question, fair question.
That is a fair
So,
question. Yeah.
uh, it's part of the woodwork, but, if you have two churches that are sharing a pastor, I was just working with some folks earlier this week. It's important if a church wants to explore that. Um, well, even just calling a pastor, let me back up and say, anytime you call a pastor, you really should do a lot of work up front on what are your expectations and what is your sustainable, note that word, sustainable
Mhm.
level of pastoral budget, and find how that balance is. So if you're a church that says, okay, we've come to realize we need a half-time pastor, that's going to hopefully, again, change the tone and the nature of the church's thinking, the congregants' thinking about ministry. Uh, and then, well, okay, well, 100% minus 50%, how's this person's other 50% going to come? A lot of times, second career clergy have a pension, they have a spouse who works, they have, benefits might come through the spouse's job. Uh, and so it's this kind of balancing. We also, a decade ago, Jeff Woods, who has been our general secretary and continues on the staff of OGS, he said, well, really, let's avoid the bivocational word. It's a good word, but maybe our churches need to hear about multiple income pastors. And sure enough, when I got thinking about it, I had a Presbyterian colleague in Vermont who, at tax time, April 15th, had
Mhm.
5 different W-2s. She was a chaplain for hospice. She was a quarter-time interim for church, and then she had 3 other seasonal jobs. And cumulatively, that helped her bring to her household a full-time equivalent income. And yet, I don't think we kind of think of pastors needing to have multiple sources of income. So becoming a
Mhm.
multiple source income pastor, most of us are already, but it's getting the congregation to realize, oh, if we're compensating a pastor 50%, and this other church maybe is another quarter, we're still dealing with that person's going to need a quarter more income to
Yeah,
be sustainable.
yeah,
I have a colleague who is quarter time at 2 churches. So 25 plus 25 still leaves 50%, honestly, to be found. So again, the economics of ministry are inescapable. It's just trying to bring to the forefront, if you talk about it and you reason through it, I think you're going to be able to have some better conversations, because everybody wants a pastor to stay. I mean, everybody. I mean, my joke is when you get called at the church and they say, well, the vote was affirmative. Will you come? Now, why didn't you start 3 weeks ago?
mhm,
Everybody wants that pastor there, especially if you're on the search committee. You want to be done.
right,
But nobody really wants often to talk about how do we maintain the long-term relationship. And so pastoral relations committees can be helpful. Having good feedback loops of communication between the pastor and the leadership of the church is important. But I think, again, if we can work through some of the economic issues, it will also help us with the communication issues. If we work through some of the communication issues, it will help us with the economic issues. And best yet, the written and unwritten parts of how churches operate will be a little more brought into parallel.
so, let's say we've got somebody who's listening,
Mhm.
or watching, and they're going, "I need to talk to Jerrod about this, like, how we do this." Okay. Well, yeah, they probably ought to talk to their region person first, but,
Well,
I
yeah, I
mean,
mean, I think it's very contextual, because how this works in upstate may be a different story in another region,
yeah,
uh, and I think every region is wrestling with it. So my ideas, what I'm working on, is meant to be open source, shared, and also hopefully contextualized to what makes sense for the given other region, association, what have you.
yeah,
We're all in this together. And so I'm glad I've had the brain space, per se, on sabbatical to do some of this work. But I do want to hear from people.
yeah.
One thing I will mention is, in during the pandemic, uh, there was a book published called "Part Time is Plenty."
I wondered if you were gonna bring that up.
Yeah, got it right here.
That was a good book.
Yeah, "Part Time is Plenty: Thriving Without Full-Time Clergy."
I'll put a
I
link
think
in
the
the
subtitle is where a lot of our churches struggle, going, really? We can thrive without full-time clergy? G. Jeffrey McDonald is a UCC pastor and a journalist, so a bivocational or multiple income pastor himself. He got a sabbatical grant from the Bangor Seminary Foundation in Maine, and eventually birthed this book. What's interesting is he spent that time interviewing churches in more mainline Protestant contacts, so Presbyterian, United Methodist, ELCA Lutheran, UCC. He didn't interview any American Baptists, which he notes was unfortunate when an American Baptist comes up and says, "Hey, where were we in the book?" But the thing is, it speaks deeply to some of the issues, and it's well written. And we did a seminar workshop weekend in 2021, which we have web indexed on our webpage, which is www.abc-nys.org. And when you go to that web page for the region, you click on the Ministries tab, drop-down menu, you'll see Pastoring in Upstate New York as the option. Well, there you will find the information about this book, the YouTube sessions that we did with a pastor in our region who does assist Dr. Kelsey, the executive minister, and I with some of our face-to-face work with search committees. He presented and contextualized some of the learnings from this book, and we had a very good time talking about this with congregations who were either doing it or thinking about they need to do the part-time thing.
Yeah.
And so this book came out from Westminster John Knox Press, and is very well done. Of course, usually when I read such,
I'll agree. I
well,
read it too. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
my joke is also, where were you when I needed you 20 years ago? Uh, that's, which is always a sign of,
Exactly. I mean,
you know. So that, and then also on that same web link right now is the sabbatical project piece that I did.
okay.
The guide for calling part-time and shared pastors. And again, it's there for download, for use, for your edification. And so
Okay.
you'll see that.
So I'll put not only will I put all your links for your places where you've authored and things like that, but I will add to the show notes and the links for this one for the book, and I can put one in there for your
Yeah, yeah.
ABCNYS, and so folks
Mhm.
can go right there and check it out.
Yeah. Again, I'm hoping to start conversations,
Yeah,
plural.
yeah.
And so, starting to share this information more broadly. And, again, as I say on the cover page, this is a draft. Um, so many of our resources historically have been kind of set in stone, and I think there needs to just be this reality that the Etch-a-Sketch is far more a tool of the Baptist than meets the eye.
I like that. I like
Yeah.
that. So as we wrap up our conversation today, I have to ask you that joy question. It's that question that everybody gets. So think about all the things you do, and you get to answer this any way you want.
Mhm.
What brings
Mhm.
you joy?
What brings me joy? Well, the love of a good spouse. My wife and I have been together for,
Oh,
25 years, been married for 24. We met at Central. Uh, so first and foremost, my wife Carrie is part of my joy. She sometimes worries I'm, a little bit, like but that's marriage. But
yeah, yeah.
uh, the grace. Stanley Hauerwas once said in one of his books, that there's the grace of cats in the household. And so our three cats do provide some companionship. My dog Fable, who is actually down here at my feet in her little basket
Um,
snoozing. Thankfully, nobody has gone by in a big truck or knocked on the door. Otherwise, we would have to stop recording and deal with
yeah.
an irate beagle. Beagles make a joyful noise, even
Yes.
if you do not wish them to.
Uh,
I do enjoy a fair amount of pop culture. And so, actually, for our ABY convention back in November, they asked me to do a workshop on superheroes and faith. And so that's another little presentation I have floating out there that I think even grown-ups would like to be engaged by. I'm primarily
mhm.
a comics person uh, in my comic book reading, and I, lifelong fan, very lifelong fan of Doctor Who, and so love it in all of its different eras, and eagerly await the latest, novelization, or the latest, action figure. I do keep the Doctors uh, in front of me here across a bookcase, and so I look forward to adding Ncuti Gatwa's 15th Doctor.
Yeah.
Uh, they just announced at a toy fair in London that it's coming, uh, so I'm looking forward to adding him alongside Jodie Whittaker and her predecessors.
That might take another trip to the Doctor Who store in Indiana when that's
I'm sure they're
um,
grateful anytime there's a new release.
yeah. Um, well, I'm grateful for you. Um, I mean, we met when I was in this call process, and it seems like forever and also yesterday at the same time. But I'm grateful for you and your ministry and just how supportive you are to not only the clergy in your region, but your colleagues, um, American Baptist and ecumenically. Um, I'm grateful. So, um, thank you for sharing this with the audience, and I look forward to seeing the evolution of where it goes, how it changes, and what God's going to do with all that. So, thank you, and thank you to our audience for listening, for watching, and for being a part of the messiness that is ministry. We'll see you next time.